So moving on to the football side of things, North Texas lost a lot of returning production from an offense that was really rolling last season. They ranked sixth in total offense, averaging just under 500 yards a game, 12th in passing, just over 300 yards per game, and 22nd in rushing offense, almost 200 yards a game. And then they put up a lot of points too, ranking 20th, 34 and a half points per game. So, last year that he really had the offense going there in year one, but they're going to have to replace some of those pieces from last year. So we're going to take a look at the position, kind of where it all starts, and that is quarterback for the offense, and probably one of the biggest question marks, I guess, going into the spring. You've written about it numerous times in several articles. They lost last year's starter Chandler Rogers to California. Stone Earl entered the transfer portal, but they were able to talk him back into returning. And they have a commitment from former TCU quarterback Chandler Morris, but he will not arrive until the summer. We were talking a little bit before the show, the general consensus is folks feel like that aren't necessarily know as much about North Texas as you. The general consensus, I think, is that this is Chandler Morris's job to lose. Do you feel that same way, or you think it's going to be, he's really going to have to push hard and win the job?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be a competitive deal. Coach Morris was talking about how Stone has grown and developed over the course of his time at North Texas, and then he's a very knowledgeable guy in terms of the system and things like that. And so it'll be a battle going in the summer. I just don't. When it comes down to it, I think you're going to end up seeing Chandler Morris end up being the guy here. I mean, this guy was a high-end recruit at Highland Park, went to Oklahoma, transferred to TCU, put up over 2,400 passing yards at TCU. And really the thing that did him in at TCU was just being injured all the time. Yeah. It wasn't like he just flat out was terrible and lost the job to somebody else. I mean, he won that job twice.
He won it twice, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty impressive. A guy that's won it twice at TCU. I really like Stone as a guy, and I think he's a good player. But I mean, this guy was a guy that went to an FCS school out of high school, and didn't win it. Ended up keeping. He had some injury problems at ACU as well, but ended up not hanging on to the job at ACU. And then he comes over here, and he ended up winning the starting job going into last year, but only held on to it for about a game and a half, and then Chandler Rogers took over and ended up having a monster year that landed him on the radar for some of these Power 5 programs that were looking for a quarterback, So he ends up going into the portal and lands at Cal, and that was one of the schools that was recruiting him when he went to North Texas. He's one of those quarterbacks who's bounced around a lot. He started out at Southern Miss, and then he went to JUCO, and then he went to Louisiana Monroe, put up big numbers in Monroe, and then that's a program that kind of hangs on by its fingernails in terms of being a Division I program. Doesn't have a lot to work with. Went back into the portal, and then he was being recruited by Cal and North Texas and a bunch of other places. He ends up deciding to come here, and has a monster year. Now he's back in the portal and on to Cal. So but I mean, that's a guy. So I think what's going to end up happening is probably what ends up happening last year. I think Stone will put up a good fight, but I think in the end, you're going to see Chandler Morris out there for the majority of the season.
You had written an article about this, but maybe you can share with the listeners that probably haven't had the chance to read it. What was the reasoning behind Chandler not being able to, or not wanting to enroll in January, not coming till the summer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. A lot of people have asked about that, and we have written about it, and we talked to him when he committed. And the thing is, he was at Oklahoma, and then he was at TCU, and he's gotten to the point where he was just a couple of classes short of getting his degree. So he decided to stay at TCU for a couple extra months for the summer semester, or not the summer, for the spring semester, so he could finish out his degree. He's pretty much habitually at practice, though. College athletes these days, it's not like they're in class 24/7. They have especially later in your college career for these athletes, they may be on an online class or maybe having to go to a class or two here or there, but most of their time is pretty free. So he's come up here for practice quite a bit. He's always hanging around, and things like that. So he ended up staying at TCU to get his degree, and then he'll be up here in the summer to kind of quickly adapt and get ready for the year.
That's great to hear. We were talking earlier too. There's always the rumor mill that, hey, is he going to change his mind? I mean, any thoughts on that? I mean, it sounds like no, right? He's coming to practice. Sounds like he's pretty committed, but
yeah, I mean, it sure seems that way. But because I mean, at this point, there's nothing binding him, right? I mean, he could change his mind tomorrow, and and show up at Texas State to play for his dad, because there's nothing binding him, because he signed with Oklahoma and then he transferred to TCU. So with the freedom of movement for players, it's not like he signed another binding letter of intent.
He's not enrolled, or
he just decide. The thing that kind of quelled some of that a little bit was the fact that Texas State got a pretty big time quarterback transfer of their own in there to play for his dad. So, but if something happened to that guy blew out his ACL or something like that in spring practice, I mean, all those rumors would come back. But to me, and I just talked to somebody the other day, they were like, oh, they were talking about how he's going to be here soon and that kind of stuff. I just think it's gonna work out to where Morris is going to end up being the guy here for this season.
What do you think how do you think the staff was able to go about convincing Stone Earl to come back and not move on elsewhere?
Well, I mean, we talked to him about it, right, and we talked to Coach about it and things like that. And the thought process was they went to Stone after Chandler left and said, "Hey, look, you're here, the system, you've already won the job once." Granted, we eventually went to Chandler Rogers, but you've won the job once here. You're highly respected. You're a team captain. Why why go back to ACU when you can stay here and you have a chance to win the job here where you're already pretty comfortable, instead of changing schools again at this point. So they were able to convince him to come back. And, and in hindsight, you kind of wonder, I'm sure he wasn't going to change his mind, but you wonder if he knew at that point when they were trying to talk him into coming back, and did talk him into coming back, if he knew that there was going to be another transfer that's going to come in right behind him. I mean, I'm sure they told him, hey, we're still going to look for another option if we got to have another quarterback on the roster. But if he knew at that point that there was going to be a guy that started, threw for 2,400 yards in the Big 12, would he have stuck with that decision to come back? I mean, you're never going to get a straight answer on that. But if you had to shoot him up with truth serum, you kind of wonder, would he have made that same decision instead of going back to ACU? We'll never know, but that was kind of the way it played out.
Talking about some of the younger faces in that room, and they brought in Liberty transfer Reese Mooney. They had true freshman early enrollee Cash McCollum. How did those guys look in the spring?
That was one of the interesting things that happened, particularly in the spring game. Because you have Stone was definitively the best guy, but of those two, Cash McCollum really stepped forward and showed some pretty big potential. Coach Moritz compared him to Seth Hennigan, the Memphis quarterback, which is interesting because Seth played at Denton Ryan here in town before the previous staff slow played him on and offer, and then he ended up at Memphis, and then he blew up at Memphis. So, it was an interesting comparison to hear Coach compare Cash to Seth Hennigan. And there's, I can see what he's saying, because Cash is not like your super athlete kind of guy, but he's a coach's son, just like Seth was. And he went out there in the spring game and really threw the ball well, had a couple of touchdown passes. And I think he's kind of, at this point, it sure as heck looks on paper like this is your long-term kind of guy. Now, granted, they'll take a quarterback in the next cycle. So, if they get some kind of superstar kind of guy in there, that could change the dynamic of everything. But the way it sits now, it certainly looks like you've got the two older guys. You've got Stone, who's a senior. You got Chandler, who's going to be a junior, and then you got the redshirt freshman and the freshman, and then you'll bring in another guy this next cycle. But with the lay of the land now, it certainly looks like if everything plays out the way it looks like it will, it'll be okay. You've got Stone, the part stage left after this season, and you've got Chandler for this season and next season, and then the next guy in line would be Cash.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about those things, especially in today's world, right? Because it can all change tomorrow. But yeah, that's definitely encouraging and positive news to hear for sure.
Oh yeah, I mean the crazy thing is I talked to their quarterback coach Sean Brophy here over the course of spring, and that was one thing that he was kind of happy about because over the last few years, I mean they hadn't really developed over the long term a high school quarterback that kind of went through the whole growth process thing. I mean, Mason Fine they threw him in there in his freshman year, and he played 4 years. And then after he left, they had a whole bunch of transfers, guys. They went through the whole transfer process of trying to find a guy and hit on a guy. I mean, the last guy that really they took and developed over the long term that really, really worked out was Derek Thompson, who led them to the Heart of Dallas Bowl win in 2013. He was a guy that came in as a freshman and redshirted, and he got hurt at one point. But the thing is he kind of was there for the long term and developed over a course of years. And so now they've kind of got the potential with some of these young guys and having a couple of older guys that they feel good about that they can play. Okay, we can play these guys and we can develop a guy long term.
All right. Now moving on to the running game, and another question mark for this offense. They lose their top 4 rushers from a year ago in Ayo Adeyi, off to JMU, Oscar Attaway III, off to South Carolina, Isaiah Johnson, off to Albany Christian, and the aforementioned Chandler Rogers. But not all hope is lost. They do bring in transfer Zach Evans, I think on Twitter or X, the real Zach Evans, coming in from Minnesota. They got Trade Bradford from LSU, and then Ragsdale returns. How did that running back room look this spring?
Well, that's the thing. We didn't see over these guys. I mean, Akaika missed the entire spring due to injury. He got hurt really bad. He got a nasty injury last year. That's why he only played 2 games, right? So he only plays the 2 games last year before he goes down for the year. But Akaika's got some skins on the wall here. I mean, he's rushed for 1,300 yards in his career and 12 touchdowns. He had a really good year in 2022 when he ran for 755 and 7. And they did bring in the 2 transfers, but those guys didn't see a whole heck of a lot of time just because they were hurt for a big chunk of spring practice. So, I mean, you head into the fall, you've got guys that makes sense, though. I think you can have a lot of faith in Akaika if he gets back to where he's healthy. And then Zach Evans is a guy that looks like he'll be a pretty impactful player for him. I mean, that was a guy that won the I think it was the Freshman of the Week honor in the Big Ten 1 week up there before he transferred back from Minnesota. So, he's a guy that is a good player, and they have a lot of hope in. So, and the thing is Patrick Cobbs has been the running backs coach there forever, and he always has a good room of guys. I mean, he's the Hall of Famer here, played in the NFL. It just kind of bleeds green, kind of a career North Texas guy. And every year he seems to have 2, 3, 4 guys that he can roll out there. I mean, as far as like concerns for North Texas goes, I think the running backs room with Patrick running that thing is way down the list, even though they had some injury problems this year or this spring anyway.
So do you think that it's a kind of a 2-man rotation ish with Ragsdale and Evans, or still, like you said, not a lot has been seen yet, so we don't really know how that's going to play out?
Well, I mean, you just look at Patrick's history with that room. I mean, he plays a lot of guys. I mean, that's always been the case. So I would expect Ragsdale, Evans, Trey Bradford. I mean, I expect all those guys to get carries. They've got a good freshman in I mean, I don't think he'll pull. I mean, they'll probably redshirt him anyway. But you know, there's some good running backs in that room that I think that'll do. But those are the guys that I would expect. Quaylon Farr, you know, he's been around for a little while. The Kiefer Sibley guy, he's a freshman from Waco Conley. He may have a good future, but I think, you know, he's a down the line guy. There was some thought that Mackenzie McGill, a former walk-on, you know, I doubt he really makes an impact, but he did some good things in the spring. So, I mean, those are the guys you're going to see.
Week 1, who's lining up in the backfield as the week 1 starter? Not saying they might not come out after play number 2, but
I would assume Akaika.
Okay.
I mean, if he's healthy, I think you roll with your, especially since those other guys didn't play a lot in the spring too. I would assume with the amount of skins Akaika's got on the wall and the fact they trust that guy, and you know the other guys are kind of new and transfers. I'm assuming you're going to see Akaika out there, unless you know the Zach Evans guy really tears it up in fall practice. But I would expect them to if they go with the first guy out there, I would assume would be Akaika.
Moving on to the wide receiver room in 2023, Jamori Macklin broke out in a big way. 57 receptions for 1,004 yards and 11 touchdowns, but sadly he decided to move on to Kentucky. Additionally, Roderick Burns graduated. Trey Cleveland moved on to Abilene Christian. But they do have some quality returners. They have Damon Ward, Landon Sides, Blair Conwright, Jordan Smart, and then they brought in transfer DT Sheffield, who I believe was recruited by Eric Morris to Washington State and has now followed him to North Texas. How did that wide receiver room look this spring?
Well, it's kind of the same thing with as with the running backs. You know, Jeremiah Aaron from West Virginia is another guy in there, and Dalton Carnes from Houston. So, but a lot of those guys were hurt all spring. You know, we didn't see anything of Landon. Landon was out the whole spring. Jeremiah Aaron, he looked good in practice in the first couple of weeks. He got hurt. He was out the rest of the spring. So, some of these other guys, look pretty good. I mean, DT Sheffield was a guy that Coach Morris recruited when he was at Washington State. I think he'll contribute. Blair Conwright, he came over from TCU and is just a well-respected guy within the program. After a year, they tried him out there quite a bit in terms of talking to the media. And Mason Ferguson was an early enrollee that I think is going to show up this fall. He was committed to Louisiana Tech, a DFW guy that was committed to Louisiana Tech, and he flipped to North Texas. That was a big flip for North Texas because that guy showed up in spring practice and kind of like the quarterback, kind of like Cash did. He just immediately looked at home. He looked like he fit as a guy that should be in class, at his high school. It's the same way with Tyler Mercer, the offensive lineman. They flipped from Tulane at the very, very last minute. He was another mid-year enrollee that looked really good. So I think Mason Ferguson will be another guy you see out there. And that's the big question. I think that, do you have the one guy that can take the place of your leading receiver that was a really good player and put up a bunch of huge numbers? I mean, do you have that lead dog like you did last year? And I think that remains to be seen. I think the first guy up, though, is definitely going to be Damon Ward. I think he's done a lot over the course of his career and has the trust of the staff and the rest and the quarterbacks in that room. But do they have somebody that can put up the kind of numbers Jamori did? I mean, Jamori had 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns last year. I mean, I don't know if they're going to have that one lead guy like they did last year, maybe more by committee, but we'll see. I mean, maybe one of these guys will come out of nowhere, just like he did last year. I mean, nobody was expecting Jamori to put up monster numbers, although he did have an impressive pedigree. So, I mean, we'll see this fall. Maybe one of these guys manages that.
If you had to predict who the 3 starters are, what would be your prediction?
Well, with the offense that they run, I mean, right now it looks like it'd be Damon, Blair, Probably Jeremiah, Aaron, and Landon would be the 4 guys. Was what I've got on my projected depth chart for next year.
There's one guy who's not there yet, but I've seen some things about him. He seems pretty exciting. Looks like he'd fit really well in Eric Morris' offense. I was wondering what you could tell us about Miles Coleman.
Yeah, he's probably one of the more interesting prospects they signed this last year, because the guy is just blazing fast, but he's just incredibly short. Like he's like 5'5". He's just a tiny guy, and see, if you're a guy like that, not tiny, he's just short, right? Yeah. But if you're a guy like that, you need to find a home where you fit in a specific offense. And this is the offense that can fit a guy that's 5'5", right? So, he'll come in the fall, and it's just, can he translate that speed into being an immediate impact player as far as coming in as a slot guy, so he'd be one of those guys you're looking at in that kind of role. And it'd be, we'll see. Some of those guys, receivers, a place where you can walk in day one, and if you can learn the offense and things like that, you can make an immediate impact. So we may see him. You never know.
All right, much like the rest of the offensive line lost some production as well, with Casey Morka and is it Deonze Carroll graduating?
Oh, Dazion, yeah, he graduated last year. He was a pretty key member of their offensive line for years, and then he just he was a backup in his last year after having some injury problems. But they did lose him. Yeah, he's gone after this year.
And then we got some transfers in Ethan Miner and then Fobechi Nuwau.
Fobechi, yeah, Fobechi went to Oklahoma. So those are 2 pretty big losses. That's where a lot of their run game production came from. And one of the interesting things about the way that all played out was they tried to move Fobechi to tackle last year. They tried it in spring practice. They're like, okay, this guy's terrific. We're going to move him out to tackle. And he looked like he was, he can handle the job. But man, they moved Fobechi out of there. Like the first 2 games of the year, their running game was terrible. It was just awful. And so they decided, well, this isn't working. They moved Fobechi back to guard, and then all of a sudden they're running for 200 plus yards a game again. So that was just that was one of those weird decisions that you look back and you're like, why did they do that? Because he was so great at guard, and once they moved him back in there, right next to Miner, you've got. You think about it, that was really where their run game was. One of the big reasons their run game was so effective. You have a guy sitting there in Miner who was an SEC quality player. At least Mississippi State thought he was an SEC quality player. They picked him up as a transfer into Wawa. Once he goes to Oklahoma, so you had 2 guys that were power 5 level, SEC level offensive linemen right next to each other in the middle of that offensive line. And once they put them back together in the middle like that, their running game was just immensely better.
But their pass protection, not so great, as they ranked 113th in terms of allowing sacks, giving up 3.17 a game. How did the Mean Green shore up that offensive line, and how'd they look this spring?
Well, I thought the group looked pretty good. They brought in a couple of pretty key transfers, and that was the thing. Mekhi Lee, just a monstrous tackle, like a 350-pound guy. He was one of the better junior college offensive linemen in the country, and then he ends up going to Missouri, and he just sat the bench up there, didn't really play at all. Well, they picked him up out of the portal, and they also picked up Landon Peterson, who was an offensive lineman at Texas Tech, who did start some games up there and showed a lot, but ended up kind of falling down the depth chart. Well, all of a sudden you look at the depth chart there, those guys are both there. So, you're looking at Mekhi Lee. Gabe Blair was a terrific offensive lineman for them, has been for a long time. He'll be back. they're looking at they moved Denton played tackle for them for quite a while. He's played pretty much everywhere. He's played guard, he's played tackle. They're moving him to center. So he moves inside the center, and then you got Landon at guard. And then the other question is, what do you do at right tackle? They brought in Jasper Watt, who was a converted tight end. He was actually from town here. Well, not actually from town, but he's from Argyle, like the next town over. And he's the son of a very famous NFL strength and conditioning coach who just recently retired. And they have a Texas Tech transfer that was here beginning last year named Larry Moore. So those two guys are sitting there at right tackle. And it's just going to be a matter of how these guys come together, because you do have a lot of new pieces out there. I mean, if the depth chart holds up, I mean, the only guy that's going to be back in the same place he was last year if they start this way would be Gabe Blair. So it's pretty much a reconstituted group. It did look pretty good in the spring, but we're just going to have to see how it meshes together once they get out there on Saturdays.
In a recent article, you mentioned a new tight end for the Mean Green that kind of had an impact in the spring, and in particular spring game. Last season, the tight end wasn't really utilized much in the passing game. With this addition, what you saw in the spring, tell us about the kid and what do you expect for him to, his production to kind of look like in 2024?
Well, I mean, that's a big question. The guy we're discussing here is Oscar Hammond. They didn't really get much production out of the tight end position last year, as they kind of transitioned to, a different look on offense and that kind of thing. They wanted to get somebody in there that would maybe help them out at that position. And they went and grabbed Oscar out of the transfer portal from a Division II school up in Oklahoma, where he was like a second or third team, but he was like second or third team all Lone Star Conference up there at Central Oklahoma. And they grabbed him, and he came down here, and he just had a terrific spring. He was all over the place, made a lot of good catches down the field, showed the ability to be an impact weapon offensively. And I'm assuming that he's going to start. Now, how much they use the tight end, kind of remains to be seen. But I think this is a coach and a coaching staff that'll adjust to their talent. And this guy looks like he can be a bit more of a weapon than they had there in the past. So that developments in the spring. He did have a touchdown catch in the spring. Yeah, I think if this is just off memory here, but I think he had like 4 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown in the spring.
Yeah, I think that's what your article said. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so this guy all of a sudden looks like he could potentially be another piece of the puzzle there offensively, which I think would help them. The more in this kind of offense, when you're running four wide receivers out there, the more guys that you have and you're throwing it all the time, the more guys you have that can pose a threat, I think the better off you are. And he's just another guy. He just adds another dimension to what they've got.
So if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, would you pick for that to be?
A breakout season? I mean, the obvious pick would be Chandler Morris, but that's kind of a no-brainer with the spread system, right? What you're more looking at is like who's going to be your skill position guy that kind of comes through. I think Landon Sides would be a good pick just because, he was a freshman last year that they threw out there. He showed that he could play right away, and he put up some pretty good numbers. And Landon had 30 catches for 363 yards and 4 touchdowns, which, isn't a huge number, but I think his production will definitely go up. If you're looking for somebody to come out of nowhere, I would assume it'd be Jeremiah Aaron, the transfer they brought in from West Virginia, because he had a really good beginning part of the spring before he got hurt and then kind of vanished. But I would assume that, if he moves into that starting X spot, he might be the kind of guy that could have some pretty big numbers there.